Mixing with Mike, mixing tips, setting bus output levels. One of the questions I get quite a lot, particularly with my mastering work, is how to process the output bus. And in working in a mix and printing a mix, one of the things that most engineers or mastering engineers will look for is a bit of headroom. So I think if you were just sort of deciding what it is that you wanted to do as far as processing the mix, if you're going to apply a compressor, then there's nothing wrong with that as long as it artistically fits in, or you're really getting something that you particularly really like. There's two ways to go about working with this, but let's start by how this plays into working with the final mix output level. So in general, when I'm mixing, I try to target a peak level being somewhere around -3 and somewhere in that area. So my highest peak is generally somewhere in the -3 area and not all the way up to 0, sometimes lower. So I don't get hypercritical about that, in that I don't need it to be this exact output level. My general rule of thumb is I always try to keep my master fader at 0. So other than programming a fade in or a fade out, I try to keep it there. Now, one of the reasons why, particularly if you're working with Pro Tools where this can be an issue, is that the master fader is prior to the compression. So if you start playing with fader rides and you start riding up and down your levels, one of the things that's going to happen is it's going to affect the way that your compressor works. And this is more or less a whole other subject. Sometimes this is really cool because if you're compressing, and sometimes compressing pretty heavily, what happens is as you fade out, that compressor starts compressing less. And it can have an unusual effect, which is kind of cool, in that the mix actually starts to open up as it becomes less compressed as you're doing the fade out. And that's kind of an interesting effect. Now, the reason why Abbott or DigiDesign had done this in particular, I'm not really sure what their exact reasoning behind that was. In my experience, in terms of working with professional analog consoles, I always try to put the mix bus compressor would always be prior to the master fader, not after it, for exactly that reason. Now, so in working with this, if you kind of stick to that habit, then really a lot of the individual levels are going to come from grouping. And so this is where having stems or having your audio tracks stemmed out is really important. So one of the things that when you are working with this is that I want to make sure that whatever it is that I'm monitoring, if I cut my input signal and I hear my stems and I hear anything, I want to make sure that those things are actually routed into normal effects. So as I play a mix here, I want to make sure that as I mute this, I'm actually not getting any extraneous stuff in here. Now, this is the area where I would adjust my overall gains going into the final mix bus. So for example here, one of the things that I can do, because these are normal aux channels. So what's happening here is I have stemmed or groups of instruments, bass and drums into bus 1. I have keyboards going into bus 3 and 4. I have the bus vocals going into 7 and 8. And and that pretty much follows all the way throughout. The only exception here being the drum squash, and that's a whole other topic of discussion here. So I can actually include this even into my channel. That ends up being like a whole other topic. But so if this is my stem output, then this would be the place where I can control my overall mix bus level. Now, this is still going to come in prior to my bus compression, but before I set my bus compression, this is the place where I'm going to kind of want to get my overall level set here. So in this case, I may need to call up some form of a meter that is going to give me something a little bit more accurate of a measurement of what I have going on. So here, if I call up a durometer, I can sort of look at my overall peak levels. So I'm going to look at without compression here, seeing what's going on. So I'm going to reset this here. So I'm trying to targeting this -6 to -3 area. So as I kind of work through these different settings, and I'll kind of put the background vocals back in here, what I really want to get is that basic level here. Now, when I apply my compression, if I need to adjust my threshold to get that amount of compression or whatever I was going for. Now I'm going to target this, and I'll reset here, and I'm going to adjust my output gain accordingly here. So this is giving me a little bit more consistently. Interesting that it's adding gain, even though my output gain it's probably a lot of it has to do with the attack settings and how it's allowing that to kind of pump or pop through with the punch setting here. So I want to make sure I'm not losing the sound or lose the mix bus compressor altogether. What I primarily want to do is I want to stay away from any limiting on that. I may throw a limiter on there as a means of just sort of printing a quasi-mastered version for the client to listen to if I'm sending them an MP3 or a kind of mix at its current state if it's getting near the end. And sometimes that's just a very quick way of giving them a reference that kind of works a little bit closer, more closely structured to the levels they would expect from other mixes that they may be referencing. And in that, I would never do anything aggressive. Now, if I'm not really clear or happy about this compressor, or I'm just, undecided about it, it's like nothing particularly special about it, then I'll just leave it out for the mastering engineer and give them something better to work with. Or if I really like it, but maybe the mastering compressor I feel has, a mastering engineer has something better, then I'll print them two versions. I'll print it without the mix bus compression and with the mix bus compression. Now, just to step back for a second here, one of the reasons why I go here to the stem outputs to bring these down, and sometimes it's just easier for display purposes here. If I have compression or limiting here, which I may have a tendency to do instead of being on the mix bus, I may pull the output gain of these guys down, those inserts, in order to get my gain and kind of keep my overall gain here. But the reason why I don't pull it down on the fader levels, and this is really critically important to understand, if you go and you select, say, the all group here, and you pull all the faders down, and you pull all the audio tracks and their feeds into the effects, and you're pulling the effects down too, then you're drying up the mix. So in other words, if I take all the faders, including my effects returns, then the faders being pulled down 2 dB then feeds 2 dB less signal into the effects. And then if you pull the output of the effects down by 2 dB, you're not only changing the level or the amount of wet signal, but also how it actually works. And if you're feeding into parallel compression chains and things like that, then what happens is you're changing the amount of gain that's feeding into those parallel compression chains. And that gets to be really, really tricky. So what you want to do, the other way to do it would be to pull down just the audio tracks, but even there, the parallel compression chains get messed up, and the feed into those effects processing devices may change subtly in character. Now, when you work with individual sounds and effects, you are very carefully kind of getting and crafting those individual effects and delays. And when you arbitrarily change a level that's feeding into that, it's going to change your settings in subtle ways that are not going to necessarily be reflected. Like, you're not going to hear that, obviously, but what's going to happen is when you bring that overall gain down, it's just not going to feel the same. And part of you will think, oh, that's just the gain, but it's more than that. It's also the feed into all of those other effects and parallel compression chains and things like that. So that's why pulling it down at the very end, before you get to the mix bus, is advantageous because you're not changing your mix at all. You're pulling everything down exactly proportionally, and you're feeding the output of everything, not anything that feeds into the input of anything. The only thing this would feed into the input of is your mix bus compressor, and that would still be the thing here. So I have one question here on the chat for this, which is still a problem if you clip your individual channels when you pull down the subgroup channels? Okay, that's an excellent question. So when you clip on individual channels, depending upon the host that you're using. So here, like for example, in Pro Tools 11 where I'm doing this, it's a 64-bit host. So even though you are getting clipping within the individual audio track, it's not clipping in terms of the math, in terms of the way that the actual DAW is dealing with the audio. If you happen to have, and in this case you're only allowed to use 64-bit plugins, so you have more than enough headroom that is within there. It's the only place where you actually hear the clipping is at the D to A conversion stage, and that's where the clipping becomes an issue. So if you print and output your mix, then it's going to truncate off everything that's above 0 dBFS, and therefore you'll just get flat lined out for everything above there. So that's not necessarily a problem as long as the output in the end is below that, so those transient peaks are preserved. So that doesn't mean that you want to get into the habit of having clipping on your individual channels. So the idea is that as you're working with different sounds, you want to keep your signal flow as such that you're not clipping within the channel, even necessarily within plugins, unless that's part of the sound. So sometimes it's advantageous here to not to monitor post fader, but actually to go through here and do pre-fader metering, because this will give you a post plugin pre-fader reading. So if your fader is at -10, you still may be clipping kind of prior to that. Again, for a 64-bit host, that's not an issue. You really won't technically get that type of clipping at the output. And in the end, as long as it's done correctly, you should be good to go. So the idea there is that giving that bit of headroom, it becomes very easy now to adjust the gain, and it gives the mastering engineer some room to work with. Some mastering engineers may ask for a -10 peak signal. My personal preference is somewhere in the -6 to -3 dBFS range for the peak signal. So the average is going to sit down a bit lower from there. Usually, if you're not heavily compressing, then there'll be a difference between the peak and the average level will have a tendency to be somewhere in the 10 or 12 to 15 dB of difference between the peak and the average level. So you just have to call up your meters and kind of monitor where the average signal is residing. So you can see here the average signal is residing somewhere here in that -19 area, and the peak signal is at -4, so that's a -14, what they call crest factor, which is the difference between the peak signal level and the actual average signal level. So that's just a rough estimate, and that'll kind of give you like a good idea, and it'll give the mastering engineer something to work with in terms of the dynamic range and maximizing the gain at the output. All right, there's a quick tip on, not a quick tip, a long-winded tip actually, on setting the output level for your mix.